Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so we're going to be focusing on approaching painting techniques, both in a digital and a traditional method. Now, before we fully understand the approach to a digital method, we have to understand the painting principles of the traditional format. Now, it does not matter the medium you're using, whether digital or traditional, the processes remain the same. It is not just applicable to Photoshop, but any digital platform to utilize for your digital application. So, in understanding our approach, let's first look at the most common mediums used to create painting effects. The common mediums are usually water-based paint or water paint and acrylic and oil paint. So these are common mediums utilized to create a painterly effect. Both do have an application to give vivid contrast or color, but the concept in how they're applied varies. Now, I always prefer to start with a watercolor approach, as this is one of the easiest and simpler methods to identify in creating holistic effects. So when using watercolors, there are a few principles that we apply or approach with. First being simplification. And as it states, simplifying what is being done or what should be done helps to create or helps the artist control where they are utilizing their color effects. The next element which should be focused on is color mixing, as with watercolors, their applications are utilized in fusing or mixing colors to create new color effects, which also brings in account values or effect of light on an object. This is essential as contrast or value or light effects do help to sell the idea of the depth of the object, whether it's three-dimensional, whether it's flat. So these value effects are important in selling the space the object or the person is occupying. So to simplify, consider drawing basic shapes to identify the space for which you will be applying your color. So all areas are governed by a particular shape. In identifying shapes, you are controlling the space for which all your color applications will be placed. And these shapes do not have to be geometric, they can be organic. They identify the movement for the area to be filled. Now, this identifies simplifying that area, or in the term as we would use, cell shading or blocking, as is the common reference. Color mixing is based on the use or consistency of the watercolor paint being applied. Now, watercolor paint is always identified by its translucency. It is not very opaque. So the aim for watercolor paints is to identify some transition of light through that element. So one of the most common techniques used in watercolor application is resist, which shows or keeps you from covering areas. So resist application identifies an area which you do not want the paint to absorb or take up. This would remain untouched. It also identifies the use of layering, which gives you the application of one color over the next. So though colors stand strong on their own, the application of a watercolor element over another creates a change in value or color to that paint application. This initially gives you a change in the gradients being used if you're doing multiple colors, or give you a variation in value if you're doing monochromatic colors. So adding a color over a pre-existing color aims in darkening that approach or application. So in doing these formats digitally, the method used, especially in Photoshop, is to change the opacity of the color. This identifies the amount of light intensity being utilized, the amount of saturation being utilized for that color element. So making it less opaque changes the impact of its transparency, allowing one layer to show below the other or to show through each other. These applications allow for the added value of another color. If colors are not of limited opacity, then they would act as a blanket layer over another. So you will not be able to see a mixing or a variation or a blending of that color on the one it's placed on. This approach will be more of an acrylic or oil painting approach, as these items are painted when the previous color dries, creating a non-absorbent layer or a non-transparent layer for the color that is being applied on top of it. So in using the oil painting method, we're still working with a combination of color mixing, layering, blocking, and values. The variations for this is that your color selections have to be distinctive and pre-identified. So it is not the approach of mixing the color on the canvas. It is selecting a color and then applying this color to selected areas on your canvas or in your drawing. This by allowing the layering method to be more appealing in this area. However, layering in this method requires that the previous color is dried before the secondary color is applied. In digital painting, this is only corrected by ensuring that you're using 100% opacity, so there is no gradation or blending of the colors on each other. In these applications, your blending methods are only created by smudging or blurring edges or using colors close in value to the color it's laid beside. So in this first example, we identified the effect of a watercolor leaf versus the effect of an oil or acrylic painted leaf. It should be noted that the application of colors in a layering technique still identifies how they are placed. We will note that the lightest areas will always be utilized by the color of your surface or the color of your paper. So those will still remain as your lightest areas. Your color application will be varied according to the areas of light, medium, or dark value. Now, the colors being used are of the same hue. However, applied in a watercolor method, when they are placed on top of each other, the secondary color will gain a darker value, as the opacity of the second color is low, so placed on itself, it gets a darker hue or a darker value. So in darkening areas that are done in a watercolor effect, you are simply using the same hue, same opacity, same color intensity, but you're applying it more and more on the same area or surface. This helps to darken or helps to add more value to the color it's placed on top of. we're still using the same application methods. However, in an oil-based or acrylic-based method, you are simply mixing the color variations, so your color application should stand out. It is also noted that colors do have a change in intensity based on the color they're placed beside. So initially, colors placed close to their common hue or close to their opacity color will always seem lighter because there's not much contrast. When they're placed against a more contrasting area, that color will always have more intensity by either being more green, more yellow, more brown, because it is going against a pure background. If it's placed beside something complementary, which is close in hue to that color, it will change the impact of the color to the eye. So the variations that we have is just based on the color application and the color opacity. In the digital method, having an understanding of how these work identifies how you will be applying them and how you'll be using them in your application. Okay, so in starting simple, we originally started out with the application of our forms. So in identifying our 4 forms, we readily had a quick sketch of how these forms will be created. Now, whether digitally or traditionally, your sketch application is always your lightest application. It helps to identify use of space, your use of proportions, and positioning of your items. Once your composition is correct, you will apply your detail lines to verify the finalized shape or form that you are utilizing. In having this information, we simply would move on to the application of color or value. This is all dependent on direction of light or your light source. The position of your light source identifies the areas on your object that light will affect, giving a direct understanding of where your light, medium, and dark areas should be. In applying this, you will always need to identify from where your light source would be emitted. Now, in application, we know that the top of all light or all surfaces will receive light first. Now, when we're doing a watercolor approach, we're going to be ensuring that we are simplifying where those light areas will hit first. So we literally do not apply any color to our lightest areas. So we apply our first area of colors to our medium areas. In using a watercolor application, we want to ensure that our color opacity is low. So we'll always go with a 50% opacity to utilize that effect. If we are doing it traditionally, we will ensure to mix that paint solution with more water, thereby diluting its translucency or creating a more translucent effect. Once we have that translucency or that consistency identified, so in the digital method, we'll go 50 or below 50%, depending on how light or how translucent you want your color to be. Once we have that first application, we'll be simplifying by identifying the area where our second layer, our second application will be. You will note in this application, I am simply adding the same color over the pre-existing color. So I'm not changing the color value, I'm not changing the color opacity, I'm just adding the same fill over the previous. And you will notice that there is going to be a variation in that color hue or color intensity. So as we layer these colors onto each other, we are creating a stronger color or a more vibrant color or a stronger hue. So we can see the variation of that application. Now, this effect can also be used if you are changing the value of the color, as placing it on top of the pre-existing color will only help to strengthen that color or make it less opaque. For our shadows, notify that shadows are simply a darker version of the surface. So your shadows are simply a darker value of the surface. So you can always darken your colors, or you can always darken your values or your saturation in order to have it becoming a darker element over the surface it's being placed on. Now, the watercolor effects are simply by ignoring the strongest areas of light, allowing that to be the paper or the surface you're painting on. Your oil or acrylic applications, however, those layering methods are simply utilized by applying a strong opacity, a strong intensity of color on top of each other. We should be working in the same effect. However, when we're applying acrylic or oil paints, we're applying an area of color on top of an area of color. So even for our lighter areas, we're still going to be building our darks first and then placing lighter values on top of that, or darker values beside each other. So we are layering fully the effect that we want. However, colors must be pre-mixed to identify the lighter or darker value you're trying to create. So in using these sources, you are putting in your base color, you're applying your base color first, and then utilizing other colors on top of that base, which identifies if you are going darker than that base or lighter than that base. This will also mean, are you going darker than the color you're placing it beside or lighter than the color you're placing it beside? These will always give you clear connections with how the colors are read. To control these color applications or these layering applications, Photoshop has created pre-existing layers. So in the traditional method, where we'll be painting one, allowing it to dry, then painting on top of it, what the digital platform has done is created a safe layer where your color is set and you can apply a new layer. So you wouldn't have to interfere with the pre-existing color. So the layer panel works in this method of identifying a layering approach, placing on top of. So as we change the opacity or the fill in Photoshop, we are controlling how the colors read on top of each other. In understanding the value application to our forms, we could also look at this application to the final activity, which was to draw your computer or laptop or tablet. So in the same approach, we are sketching, planning. So we're observing the item that we have drawn. We are identifying its position, its location. We are identifying a light source. So we're using our reference to indicate what is happening to this laptop. what is happening to its position, its angle. Once we have our sketch lines identified, we would put in our finalized lines so that we have an idea of the areas we are completing. So our approach would be, or for this approach, I'll be using the acrylic method and a little of the watercolor method. So my applications are going to go with my fill color first. So the shape I have utilized as my laptop, I am using an acrylic method to identify different color values that I am placing beside each other. So I am filling each shape area with a pre-mixed or pre-identified color. Once my color selection has been complete, once my color selections have been complete, I'm identifying the palette that I'm using to complete the fill of this object. If you are doing multiple objects or multiple items with the same color palette, it is always advisable to create a sample palette on your paper or on a layer where you can always reselect those colors where needed. Now, in identifying the layering application, there are two things I'm trying to control. I do not want my paint application to go outside of the surfaces I am trying to cover, which brings up a common technique called masking. In masking, similar to the watercolor effect, we are trying to avoid any color application going where we do not want it to. So we're allowing control to stay within that predefined area. So in our application, we are masking the painted areas inside the pre-filled shape. We do this in Photoshop by holding Alt and clicking on the layer above the layer or below the layer we want to be masked. There will be an arrow indicator identifying the layer is connected to. So if you paint outside of the mask shape, you will not get a painterly effect. But once we apply it to the mask shape, we will see the color application being shown. Just by verifying the size paint and the opacity I would like to use, especially for the screen area, I will be able to apply a block color. So I'm blocking in my colors now. So I'm using a value that I want to identify as the highlight area of my screen. So I'm putting where in my view, based on my light source, there is some reflected light or cast light on the screen of my object or my laptop. So in utilizing this, it's staying within the area that I have masked. I can also use this effect by adding highlights or tonal areas on the laptop itself, as this will be the reflection of my light applying to my object. So I'm doing it on the surfaces where I believe light will have an impact on. So that will be on the flat surface of the laptop at the front and on each key for the raised areas for where I believe light should be touching, as it is raised and it is a flat surface. So there should be some impacts of light on these particular areas. Once these highlights are applied, I always go about by identifying my surface. Now, my surface is always identified by a horizontal line or a diagonal line. These lines indicate flat movement. So we use the term horizon, identifying that anything above the horizon is in the air, anything below the horizon is on the ground. So identifying the separation between ground and sky. We use diagonal lines because diagonal lines indicate movement. So they state an item is either coming towards you or going away from you. They also state an item is either falling or rising. These indications have to move from a flat area upward or downward. So they indicate to the eye some level of movement. Now, in the digital method, what I have used is my Marquee tools, which I use to identify an area or a space to be filled. So I'm still using my base colors to fill the areas I intend to use. Now, the layering approach, especially in digital method, allows me to apply my color variations or my color layering methods on any part in any portion at any time, as I'm able to move in front or behind an object to apply that layer. In the traditional method, however, I have to go in the sequential order of adding on top of. If I create a mistake of a layer, I will have to ensure that layer is dried and then to reapply my corrective color to omit the color I no longer want or need. However, in a digital method, I can move those layers at any time to suit the design application. So this creates a varied timely effect. So in applying as well for the surface, I am also utilizing my masking area, as I do not want my painting approach or my painting movements to go above the surface. So I'm keeping my areas separate. So based on my light source, having a surface, I want to ensure that this object is blocking the light. And because this object is blocking the light, I will ensure that shadow is created. Now, I am also utilizing blending approaches. Now, to do a digital blend, I'm using a blurring tool. Now, the blurring tool is selected because in a traditional painting method, we would go about using what we call a dry brush method. Dry brushing uses a dry brush and it absorbs the moisture from the paint or the wet paint applied on the top surface. This is usually applied to the edge of whatever you have painted to soften that transition. So it's a method of persons usually smudging or fading out. So it's applying in the same effect. Now, blurring or blending in a digital method can be completed using your blur tool, or you can use your eraser tool at a limited opacity or at a low opacity. This is like if you shaded with a pencil and you're using the eraser to just dab or spot on top of the pencil to take away tones from that area. Or in the terms of application of makeup, where ladies would use tissue to blot or spot the lipstick. So you're fading or blending that edge away. or if you're using a sponge to blot the face to fade the makeup. So this is where this approach applies in the same manner. So in the digital method, there are various tools we could use to complete this application. We could go with new color or color close to the original color and layer it over it until we're getting close tones to the edge and allow that transition to be much smoother. Finally, in the application of our surface and shadows, we always try to identify our shadow direction and source. Using the layering method here or low opacity here, I realized that where the lines met, they're kept on being an overlaying or a darkening of that meeting spot. So I changed the value of the color, changed the position the color will be laid in, and applied it below or behind the laptop so that it's above the surface but behind the laptop or below the laptop. Now with this application, I also blended and smudged the edges, as your shadows should not be as sharp, consistent as it is the variation of light being blocked from a surface. Once there is some application where consistent, we can think about utilizing our brushes in different methods. So far we've just used basic brushes to complete our painting and texturing and application technique, our blending and smudging. However, if we are seeking to apply texture, we'd have to utilize textured brushes in Photoshop. Now, in traditional painting, we would be using different surfaces to create this textured effect. So we could use crushed up paper, a strainer, a textured cloth, a coarse brush. So there are many areas we could use to apply this texture. So in applying a rougher texture to my surface, I'm selecting a brush which imitates a rough surface, meaning there are spaces between, so there's not a flat, smooth area. So what I'll be doing is finding a value, I think, which does not detract from what I had pre-created. Using the same brush, so in loading my brushes, I would first go to select my brush icon. I would click on the arrow that's beside in my brush field, and I will check on the preset brushes that are there. If there are no preset brushes that you find interesting to use, you could also load your collection of brushes from brush applications that are available for Photoshop. So once you select the pre-design or pre-brush you're using, that brush will be loaded, and you'll be able to select from your panel the brush type you would need. This can be applied to your surface. Now, if I am also using my magic wand or my marquee selection to keep the painted area where I need it. This can also be done in using my masking effect. So both applications can work. In a traditional method, to create the masking effect, we will use like masking tape to cover an area or a sheet of paper to cover the area, so that whatever we're painting on top of the surface goes on the mask area. So when we remove that mask, we will see a clean surface or an untouched area. Based on the class activities and assignments, I do hope that these demonstrations did show some clarity onto the application of it. These methods can be applied to any digital platform, not only Photoshop. So these can be applied to any digital platform, not only Photoshop. But we are demonstrating via Photoshop, as this is one of the softwares we're using for our digital approach. Please feel free to set up a consultation at the Calendly link for any clarity or comments or questions you may have in regards to the previous presentation.